Good morning, everyone. Happy to see you all made it with our time change. Feels a little bit lighter in here, but it's okay. People got their sleep. But if you don't recognize me, my name is Noah. I'm typically across the way with the youth, hanging out with all of them in the chaos that we call youth ministry. But I'm super excited to have the opportunity to be over here with you all today and share a message. But before we jump into the passage, I wanted to talk about signs. And not like stop signs or yield signs or anything like that, but signs that something is coming. For example, a sign that spring is coming in the valley is we give a random 80-degree, 100-degree day, the blossoms start coming out, and we're like, wow, what a joy to live in the valley. And then it gets really cold again and rains. And then it'll be cold for a bit, and then it'll get really hot again. But during this time, we have these beautiful cherry blossoms and these trees blossom. Trees that are right out here. And even here in Fresno, there's cherry blossom walks. I have a photo of one that you can go. It's just gorgeous. It's a sign that spring is coming here in the valley. Or if you're a big sports fan like me, you know that football season is coming because the Chargers start posting their training camp videos, and me and Dave are getting excited, and we start saying, this is our year for what will inevitably be a disappointing season. But it's okay. It's a sign, Chargers are back. Or in the youth group, if we have a student who is coming consistently, they're there every Wednesday, every Sunday, and then it feels like they randomly dropped off the face of the earth, that's a sign that they got a new boyfriend or girlfriend. So, we'll see what we can do there. But there might be signs that we have in our own lives. You walk into work, everyone seems super rushed, there's just an air of stress. It'll probably be a hard day, that something's going on. Or if I worked in construction for a little bit, so if you show up and the boss has so lovingly bought you these sport drink Freezy Pops, you're going to be in the 105-degree heat for the entire day, and he just wants to prepare you. But signs are a part of our lives. In today's passage, Jesus is going to give us signs of destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. But if you haven't been here the past few weeks, I wanted to give you a quick recap of what we have covered the past few Sundays. So 2 weeks ago, Andy shared and talked about the authority of Jesus and being questioned on these different teachings that Jesus shared in the temple. And then last week, Brent shared a message about whose son is the Messiah. And he finished off with the widow's offering, but it's continuing the teachings that were in the temple. And today we're going to finish this section with the destruction of the temple. But at the beginning of the passage and how this section begins, I think is super important for understanding this passage. Verse 5, it says, some of the disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with these beautiful stones. They're looking at how great and magnificent this temple to God was. And I think to fully get an idea of what Jesus is talking about in this passage and give justice to how crazy this temple being destroyed was, is we need to understand what this temple looked like. Because this temple wasn't just something that was just a random tent in a field or built out of wood or plywood, but it was this amazing feat to mankind. I have this photo that kind of gives us an idea that is nowhere near give it justice. But the temple was originally constructed, and we can read about it being built and finishing and eventually being dedicated in the book of Ezra in the Old Testament. In Ezra chapter 6, they talk about it being or finished and how it looks. But then later on, it was kind of rebuilt. Wasn't rebuilt. They added on and expanded by King Herod into this amazing feat of mankind. And there's a famous historian, his name's Josephus, where he has documented a lot of stuff that have happened in the Bible, so we can kind of cross-reference what Josephus has written about with all of his texts and the Bible, and you say, oh, these things actually happened, which is why we know of certain events that took place in the Bible. But he has this whole section on what the temple looked like and all of the metals that they used and how beautiful it was. And it said that this temple was so pretty with the gold and the metals that if the sun hit it just right, it would be too blinding to look at. I mean, this temple was amazing. And all of the places that weren't covered in gold and metal had pure white marble all around it. This temple wasn't just something small, but it was gorgeous. And Josephus writes just about how amazing this is, and I wish we had time to go into it and we could talk about how intricate it was, but we don't have time. But this temple was constructed of all these different metals and all these different places. The outside's covered in these gold plates. And I have this idea of just how gorgeous it was and just how magnificent. I mean, to the point that people held this temple in such high regards that when people would ask for an oath or like a promise, they would swear by the temple, even to the point in Matthew 23:16, Jesus, as in part of his passage, he talks about the temple a little bit, where he says, "Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath." Now, that passage itself has a lot of wisdom, but we're not going to go into that today. But Jesus here is talking about this gold and just how beautiful this temple is. And I know everyone here is smart. You remember what I said 5 minutes ago, where I said this temple is going to be destroyed. How can something that is so amazing, made out of metal, so intricately crafted, be destroyed? I mean, why are we talking about how great it was? Because ultimately, the people of this time who got to stand in the temple courts or stand in the temple and look at all of this metal probably thought that it was hard to hear about how this temple was going to get destroyed. Because it wasn't just something where like a wrecking ball would come through and just kind of break down the walls a little bit. But Jesus says in verse 5 and 6 in today's passage, he says some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with these beautiful stones, with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." If we look at that temple, and we kind of hold that image in our mind, it's not like, oh, it just caught on fire. Oh, it just kind of fell apart. Not one stone will be left on another. I mean, if we took an example of something that we have today in California, of Hearst Castle. It's this amazing thing. I have this photo. This is gorgeous. Huge property. It's amazing. And we can see how big Hearst Castle is and just how expansive it is. And if you're anything like me, you're like, what's the test of true wealth, Noah? I'll show you. Can we go to the second one? 2 pools. That's how amazing this place is. You're outside swimming. I'm getting a little sunburnt. Indoor pool. Yeah, you're always good, right? As the youth person, I'm like, we should make a game where you can go from like the indoor pool and then you run to the outdoor pool. Sorry, I'm digressing. Sorry. It's a youth guy going. But Hearst Castle is a super popular place in California. On average, it sees between 500,000 people and 750,000 people visiting it a year. But if I stood on this stage and I said, one day someone's going to tear Hearst Castle down, brick by brick, where no stone will be left on one another, you wouldn't believe me. You would think I was some crazy person standing on stage just talking about these random fantasies. You wouldn't be able to believe that this magnificent castle that's been so intricately crafted would be able to be destroyed to such a small degree. And yet, that's what Jesus is saying about this temple. This great and amazing thing will be reduced down to dust. And it was. It might be a little bit of a spoiler, but the temple was eventually destroyed. So well, in fact, that even today there's disagreements as to where the temple was because it was legitimately removed stone by stone. We have no trace of a temple ever happening. I mean, this amazing temple with gold and bronze and silver and this pure white marble was dismantled into dust. And so, understandably, these guys, as they're standing in the temple, and Jesus says, hey, here's what's going to happen. They want to know, when's this going to happen? How can we prepare for this temple to get destroyed? And as we talked about, signs are important. They can tell us how to prepare for certain things, how to be ready. And so Jesus goes and lays out all of these things that are going to happen. And so I'm not going to go through all of the signs today because there's a lot and they've all happened. But there's a few that I want to talk about because I think they're important. But I also want to give proof that these signs happened, and they weren't just empty threats by Jesus saying, here's what's going to happen, and he got lucky. But these are things that happened. They're all real. And the cool part about living in 2025 is we get to look back and see all of the ways that Jesus' prophetic word came to be. And so the first thing I wanted to talk about was in verse 8, where he's talking about these people who are going to come and claim to be the Messiah. They're going to come in his name. And the first one I want to talk about was a man named Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba led a Jewish rebellion in the year 132 AD. One of the great rabbis of the time gave him the nickname Bar Kokhba. Is that right? But basically it means son of the star, son of the Messiah. Many people believe that he was the second coming of Christ, coming back to reclaim the land for Jerusalem against the Roman Empire. He came back and led this Jewish revolution. And for 3 years, they were successful. They fought off the Romans that were taking the area. Everyone thought that they had succeeded. They even minted their own coins. People believed that he was the Messiah and was going to lead them back to the time before Jesus, where they get to be God's chosen people. However, this wasn't true. While they were successful for a few years, pretty soon, a guy named Gaius Julius Caesar eventually started part of his legion, and they squashed the rebellion, and it led to 580,000 people dying in this revolution. But people believed that he was the Messiah. It's the reason why so many people gathered behind him and get ready to fight for the cause, because they believed that he was the second coming of Christ. And then we have another example, one that's a little more recent than 132 AD. It happened in 1844, and it's something called the Great Disappointment. Fantastic name for a movement, by the way. Just, you want to set yourself up for success? Great Disappointment. But it's this man named William Miller, and he studied the Bible, and he looked in the book of Daniel, and through some calculations, concluded that the world would end on October 22nd, 1844. So this obviously led to people getting ready, preparing, getting everything straight. And then on the night of October 22nd, they all joined William Miller in his church to prepare for Jesus' second coming. Spoiler, the world didn't end, okay? They were disappointed, the great disappointed. But this led to a great falling out of faith. The people who followed Walter Miller, who were called Millerites, were eventually mocked. They were made fun of. Or even back when the temple was destroyed. The temple was destroyed by a fire, or initially destroyed by a fire. And while it's caught on fire, there was a false prophet who was standing outside the temple saying, "You want to be saved? Run into the fire. That's where Jesus is. You run into the fire, you'll be saved." And it led to 6,000 refugees running into the temple and eventually passing in this great fire because they believed that this false prophet was telling them where to find the Messiah. Then in the passage, it talks about hearing of wars and uprisings. And we could talk about that forever because this earth has been full of wars and uprisings and rebellions. Truthfully, half, if not most, of history class in high schools and middle school are all about wars and uprising and how they've changed and shaped this world. And then he keeps going where he talks about famines. And we read about one in the Bible in Acts 11:28. Where it says, one of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. This happened during the reign of Claudius. And then it keeps going. The fearful sights. And in the greater Roman Empire, there were things like Pompeii that happened. That was super catastrophic and terrible. And then it talks about the great signs for heaven. And we know about this from Josephus. In AD 66, he talks about this star that they saw in the sky that looked a lot like a sword. And people were like, oh, this is the second coming of Christ. Look, there's a sword in the sky. And looking back, we believe that was Halley's Comet that was passing over the sky at the time. And Jesus then talks about the persecution that the disciples are going to face, which shouldn't be a surprise that happened because we talk about that all the time here. Which is why we see Jesus tell us to consider the cost because it's not going to be easy. And we could go on forever through all these signs and all that happened during Jesus' time and everything that he said was going to happen. But ultimately we know that the temple was destroyed stone by stone, just like he said. And the way that it was destroyed, when the fire began, it began to melt all the gold and the precious metals through all of the rocks. And when the Roman Empire walked in, they said, we want all of those precious materials. Dismantle that place stone by stone so we can get those precious materials. And they were good at what they did, and so they dismantled it so they could get all the precious metals out. Now that's a lot. History lesson. I get it, all right? I feel like if this was over at the youth, we'd stand up, do like a quick stretch, water break. We're not going to do it. We're going to keep going. But if you need to stretch, you're good, all right? But Jesus tells us about the destruction of the temple for a specific reason. Because we know about this account is told in the other Gospels as well. In Matthew 24, Mark 13, and then here in Luke 21, they all talk about this same passage, this same prophecy that Jesus talks about. And this is something that seems very important because this is something that we hear about all the time. I mean, we have the whole book of Revelation. Why do we need this passage in Luke? Tell us again about the signs. I mean, the obvious question that's hanging in the air is, why do we care? Other than the fact that this is in the Bible, we should care for that, but why is Luke intentionally putting this in the Bible so that we can read it? Because if we go back a few minutes and we talk about how amazing this was, how amazing this temple was, and how indestructible it seemed, that it was reduced to nothing. And then Jesus says that this world, that our lives, will eventually be reduced to nothing. Jesus is telling the truth about the temple, that this thing that is so gorgeous and so amazing, and it's just full of all of this human works and gold and all these things, was going to turn to nothing. And if Jesus says it's going to happen, then we better believe him. But we have all these signs, and it feels like if I were to say, okay, then what am I supposed to do? Just sit back and let it happen? Why are we being told this? And then Jesus gives us this response of how to avoid the destruction of this. He tells us to watch ourselves, to not be weighed down by carousing, drunkenness, the anxieties of this life, but always be on watch and pray. Jesus says, you want to know how to avoid the destruction of the world? Have faith in me. Have a relationship with Jesus. But if you're anything like me, I like to be prepared. If God could give me a checklist of 10 things that I need to make sure I do before the end of the world, I'm set. Let's do that. I can just go and watch the news in my Bible. I'm like, oh, famine. Oh, war. Oh, signed in the stars. Oh, here's what's going on. So I know when it's go time. And I can stand up here and be like, these 5 things happen. Jesus is coming back, but I don't think that's the point of this passage. Because here's the thing. These things are happening all of the time. Don't idolize these signs. I don't think the point of this passage is to give us this checklist of what's going to happen and then the world's going to end. And I'll tell you what, as I was studying today's passage, I looked up William Miller's math of how he decided on October 22nd, 1844. It was solid math. The numbers, it was very impressive. You know what William Miller did incorrectly? Is he idolized the science. He idolized the numbers. He idolized all the wrong things and missed the biggest part about all these signs. That they're always around. That they're happening constantly. We have these wars, these pestilences. We have earthquakes all the time, especially in California. At the time that I wrote this, I looked up how many earthquakes we had in the past 24 hours. We had 56. This is an insane amount of earthquakes. We are always shaken. Granted, they were averaging between 0.8 and 2.0, so they were smaller. But we could look at this passage and say, look, there's earthquakes. Jesus, he's got to be coming back. But these things are happening all the time. This isn't a checklist, but things that are given to us as a reminder that at any point in time, Jesus could make his return. I mean, it could be before I finish this message. It could be at the end of the week. Maybe it's never in our lifetimes. But our goal is not to idolize these signs and be on the lookout as of exactly when it's going to happen. Matthew 24, 36 through 51 is a whole passage about how we're not going to know the day. We're not going to know the hour. But I'll admit, I had fun when I was doing research and looking at all these signs and oh, look at this. This is cool. This is amazing. seeing all these things that Jesus had talked about of the temple in Jerusalem and how they all came true. But I think the reason why verse 5 is so important, because these disciples, they're looking at how great this temple is, and they're just blown away with how the temple is adorned by gold and all these things, remarking about how beautiful it was, and yet God is standing just a few feet from them. They're remarking about how beautiful, but they're forgetting of the person who made everything. They're saying, look at how gorgeous this work is, how intricate the gold is. And Jesus is literally standing just a few feet from them. And we can treat our lives like the temple too. We can look at how great our lives are and say, look at all the great things I've done. Look at the life that I've built. Look at how great I am. Or maybe our job. Or maybe a sports team. Or maybe, dare I say it, this church like it. Look at all the things that we're doing. Andy, he's so great. He's so amazing. Our worship is next level. Youth, that guy's pretty funny. You know, like we can build these things up and we get caught up in all the things of Jesus and doing all the things of Jesus that we try and hit our checklist, that we forget what it's all for. We look at the temple and say, look at how great the temple is. And Jesus is reminding us, that doesn't matter. This thing will go away. What matters is this relationship with Jesus. The temple, that's not the thing that matters. But Jesus and our relationship with him is what matters. In this passage, the end times is not what matters. But the relationship, spending time with Jesus, is what matters. How beautiful our prayers are and how eloquently we can say them and how impressive or long they are, that's not what matters. But having a time where we can be there and say, here I am, Lord. All the scars and all the darkness and all, here I am. That's what matters. There might be things in our lives that we're so focused on and we're so amazed by what we want to show people that we're missing the relationship with Jesus that's just a few feet away. We have our back turned saying, look at how great it is, and he's standing right here. And that's how we can treat these signs. And we hear a lot in the world about people, they'll stand on the street corners, or I know when I was going to Fresno State, they'll be in the free speech area, but they'll say, repent and believe because Jesus is coming back. You better be ready because Jesus is going to be here, and you better hope that you're on the right side of history. And I've always struggled with that because it feels like if someone believed because of that, then it's not a relationship because of love, but out of fear, and that's not a relationship you want. And if we say that our friendship should be characterized by love and care and not fear, then why should our relationship with the Most High be characterized by fear? But the truth is, the end times, the way I think about it is the end times is kind of like a train, right? And we're all standing on the train tracks of sin. That train's coming, and we're standing right in the middle of the direction. And I don't know when that train's going to be here. I don't know how far off it is or how close it is. But I know that once that train is here, there's nothing I can do to get out of the way. But when we have this relationship with Jesus, we can take a step off the train tracks. And so when that train comes here, just like Jesus says, that not a hair on our head will perish. But there's a lot of people in the world who are standing on those train tracks. And our job as disciples is to tell them about Jesus and help them get out of that way of that train that's coming. Our job is to help them get off those tracks. And sometimes when we feel discouraged and we feel like what we're doing is not working or it's all for nothing, or maybe we've been working with someone for a year or 2 years, and at the end they're just like, I just don't think this is for me, which can be discouraging and it can hurt. And then we go home and we turn on the TV and we see all of these signs that Jesus has talked about with the wars and the famines and the pestilences and the earth shaking and everything. And we're reminded that there's still people on those tracks. We're reminded that Jesus is coming back and there's still people who want to stay on those tracks. And that gives us the encouragement to go back and keep loving people, to keep inviting them to church, keep telling them about Jesus, to show them the love and the encouragement that we've heard that got us here. Because truthfully, whether or not that train comes in our lives shouldn't matter. But knowing that there's a path to not be hit by a train should be enough to want to get off the tracks. But like I said, our lives should not be marked by living in fear of this potential end, of the train that may or may not come, but ones that are lived like Jesus. Ones that are lived with the cross in mind. Not just living lives to just get out of the way of the train, but ones that read the signs of the end times and say, I don't want people to experience that. I'm going to tell people about Jesus. I want them to know about this. We should be living lives that are running towards Jesus. And when we look at this passage and we see these signs and we turn on the TV and say, look, they line up. Look at how all of these line up. It should be an encouragement to go out and continuously love on people, show the love of Jesus, to be the encouragement, and not live lives that live in fear, but the hope that at the end of their lives they get to hear from Jesus, well done, my good and faithful servant. And so, as we wrap up today, and I invite the band on stage, know that it will always feel like we're getting close to the end of the world. Know that we can read all throughout the Bible and feel like the end is nigh, that Jesus is going to come back tomorrow. But that should just be a reminder that there's still people who are out there who are standing on the train tracks. There's still people out there who haven't heard about Jesus yet. There's still people out there who haven't experienced the love of Jesus. And we don't go and say, you're on the train tracks, the end of the world's going to come, you better figure it out. But saying, let me tell you about Jesus. Let me tell you about the relationship that he wants with you. Because the date, the time, the end of the world isn't what matters most. But a relationship with Jesus is what matters more than anything else. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you that we're able to meet together, to be together, to hear your word, Lord. I pray that as we wrap up today, we can just continue to be encouraged to speak your word, to go to the people who need to hear it, and give them the encouragement, Lord. Because we know that when that train comes, that it doesn't matter. But what matters most is having a relationship with you. Running at you with arms wide open, ready to give you everything so that people can hear about your love, Lord. And so, Lord, we just love you, and we praise you. In your name, amen.